Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mindscape podcast. I'm your host, Sean Carroll. And if you're like me, nothing makes you happier than talking to people you disagree with. Most of us, I think, go out of our way to surround ourselves with people with utterly different perspectives. It's so boring, so tiresome to talk to people who think you're right. What we would like is to always be talking to people who have completely wrong ideas from our point of view. Well, anyway, that's what we tell ourselves sometimes. Most of us would actually say, if you asked, yes, of course, I love having a diverse selection of opinions exposing themselves to me all the time. But in fact, in practice, okay, sarcasm aside, many of us find it more comfortable, find it more easy to be surrounded by people we kind of agree with, or at least when we disagree, it's in relatively mild ways. And the academy, colleges and universities, is no different from that. And the academy, for various reasons, has leaned toward the liberal side of the spectrum for a very long time. And I think it's true. I think that the data back up the idea that it's becoming more liberal over time. So we can ask why this is. We can ask whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And that's what we're going to do today in our discussion. I'm going to talk to Musa al-Gharbi, who is a sociologist, a member of Heterodox Academy for a long time, and someone who's really, I think, done a very good job of sort of putting people's feet to the fire in the public sphere in being honest about their commitment to intellectual diversity. This is probably a good place for me to tell a story that Musa actually told while we were recording, but due to technical glitches, the recording didn't come through. So I'm going to try to tell it not quite as well as he did, but it helps illuminate his perspective, where he's coming from. When he was a graduate student at the University of Arizona, he was a teacher there, an instructor there. He wrote an article for a left-wing publication that was critical of the U.S. military. Okay, it pointed out that the military's activities in the Middle East have worked to destabilize things, that the military had conducted torture and mistreated prisoners and so forth. Various claims that you may or may not agree with, or you may not like the framing of them, but they're certainly within the realm of acceptable opinions that you should be able to have about these things. But because his name sounds kind of Arabic, and because he's Muslim, and he made critical remarks about the U.S. military, this was picked up by Fox News. And so Fox News started a little campaign. They criticized him. This caught on in other right-wing outlets, let's say that, and he got a lot of death threats and things like that. The University of Arizona sort of disowned him and said, it wasn't us, please don't take away our funding, that kind of thing. And interestingly, what Musa's response to this was to say, what I should do is write for more right-wing outlets. If he's just talking to people who are already ready to hear the message that he has, then he's not doing as much good as if he reaches a different kind of audience. And so he has done that, writing for National Review and elsewhere, and of course being active in Heterodox Academy. And his claim is that this has helped him be a better scholar and thinker, because you have to really think about what you're saying when you think that the audience you're saying it to might start out being skeptical. So I don't think we're going to come up with any answers here. I don't agree with Musa on everything. He doesn't agree with me on everything. There you go, right? But the point is, I'm not giving this podcast as a solution to the solution to these problems. I think it's a conversation we should be having. After all, as I mentioned in the podcast, when it comes to hiring new people for your department, it kind of makes sense. You're more likely to hire people you think have correct ideas than incorrect ideas, right? We all know that astronomy departments don't want to hire astrologers. We all know that physics departments don't want to hire flat earthers or anything like that. And you can say, well, those are facts, they're not values. But I think you can make the case we don't want political science departments to hire objectively pro-fascist or pro-Nazi point of views. We don't want child development departments to hire pedophiles or pro-pedophile advocates. There are some ideas we don't want to engage with. So why is it the case that a large majority of academics turn out to be liberals or leftists? Is it because people who are conservatives select themselves out, or is it because conservatives are discriminated against? And you'll be not at all surprised, I think, to learn that it's both, like many of these things actually are. So I'm on the left side of things myself, as you may have gathered over the course of many podcasts, but I actually do want to think that it's better to be surrounded by a diverse set of ideas, but ideas that sort of even if I don't agree with them, I think they have something to offer. And I think this is actually, hopefully reflected in the selection of podcast guests that I have. I am very interested in talking to people I do disagree with, but only those who I think have something to offer. And that's an interesting and very difficult distinction to try to make. So I'm not being, I don't have a feeling of superiority here with any of my academic colleagues. I recognize how hard it is to truly walk the walk when it comes to intellectual diversity, but I think it's an important thing to try to do and to try to understand what its limits as well as what its benefits really are. So that's what we're going to try to do. Let's go. Musa al-Gharbi, welcome to the Mindscape podcast.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I think it's going to be a fun conversation. I have planned it out even less than I usually plan out my podcast conversations because there's a lot of issues that are kind of tied into each other in different ways where it's hard to extract, a narrative from the beginning to the end, but I hope we can talk about a bunch of them. And they're also fraught issues, right? These are issues that are intellectually important, but also politically and emotionally fraught. So that's what I really liked about a lot of the things that I read on your website, a lot of your essays, is that you're clearly trying to be fair and analytical and rigorous about these fraught issues. So maybe the best way to dive in is through the first essay that I read, which introduced me to your work, which was about the Heterodox Academy, where you've worked for a while and have stepped down from. So maybe you could set the stage a little bit by telling us about Heterodox Academy, and especially in the article I read, it was about some of the more recent challenges that it's been facing.
Sure. So the objective of Heterodox Academy is to promote constructive disagreement and open inquiry and viewpoint diversity in institutions of higher learning. And by viewpoint diversity, we take a more holistic approach, which includes diversity along the sort of, I guess, the more standard demographic dimensions that most people in academia already care about, more or less. For instance, race, gender, socioeconomic status, geography, which is, I guess, a lot of people. It's not controversial, but it's sort of under emphasized, and then, but then also including sort of ideological diversity, and we focus a lot on the which by that we mean mostly religious and political diversity, although that's not the full extent of ideological diversity. So the organization was founded to promote those things. And basically, it's been an epic journey for the organization over the time that I was involved with it. So we were formed in early 2015, and at that time, most people, including the founders of Heterodox Academy, were assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency, and so we were engaging in this conversation from a standpoint of assuming that those of us on the left were coming from a position of I guess strength and could afford to and should be more generous, right? Generous in victory, right. or whatever, however you want to frame that. But then the election didn't go the way that a lot of people were expecting, and so the message, trying to engage with others on the left about why this was important and about why they should care about it in the age of Trump, at a time when they're very concerned about, when they're seeing horrible things happening all the time, and people are panicked and uncertain and, freaking out about the future, and where the president is saying repugnant things, and they're assuming that his supporters must also be of a similar mind, or else why would they have voted for him, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to make the case for why these things are important in the climate we found ourselves in shortly after we were formed was a very different sort of landscape to navigate than the one we had initially been expecting to enter. And then after the election, it got worse. There were these major campaigns to try to basically troll students who are especially students who are shaken up by the election and the way it went. And so higher ed became issues about and so oftentimes these people who were trying to troll these students got the reactions they were looking for. There were these big altercations, blow-ups in campuses nationwide.
So by the trolls, you mean, people inviting especially provocative speakers to campus, hoping to get a rise and a cancellation so they could act canceled and like the victims? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. So, I mean, sometimes people are invited to campus and they have something because they have something substantive to contribute to the conversation, and the people want to hear them for that reason. And even if they're controversial, that wish should be respected, right? They should have the right to hear from the people that they're trying to engage with or learn from, even if they're people that we disagree with. But in some cases, in many of these cases, people, we're inviting people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who doesn't have anything particular to say. He's like, his whole shtick was literally just trying to provoke people, and he would write essays about this. Like he had one in Breitbart that was something like how you can beat me, but spoiler, you won't. Basically, where he was saying something like, "I'm going to come to your area. I'm going to try to trigger you. I'm going to get the reaction I'm looking for, because even though you know what I'm trying to do, you won't be able to resist giving me the reaction I'm looking for, and that will, etc." So there are these people. There became this whole kind of dynamic where a lot of groups would be inviting speakers to campus basically just to troll other people, to get a reaction. Yeah. And then when they got the reaction they were looking for, it made them seem like their opponents were reactionaries who, and again, they were kind of being reactionary. They didn't have to give the people they didn't have to give the reaction that these people were trying to solicit. But it's also, at the same time as we recognize that, it's also important to recognize that the people they were engaging with weren't necessarily engaging in good for self.
Yeah, everyone is dragged down a little bit by this.
Yeah. And so this was the environment in sort of in which Heterodox Academy was trying to find its footing. So there are these major blowups at campuses nationwide. There was a significant uptick in professors being fired for political speech on the left and the right. On the right, mostly led by Fox News News campaigns, which I have some personal experience with. And then on the left, a lot of times it was sort of student-led campaigns to get someone fired for saying something they didn't like or otherwise representing. And it, escalated even to the point of physical clashes in some cases, culminating, I would say, probably with the death of Heather Heyer at University of Virginia. And so, we recognize that our initial approach to the problem, which was like, here, let's make some arguments and present some data about why this is important, like that wasn't going to cut it for the kind of problem, the kind of situation that we were facing post 2016. So we tried to be a lot more systematic in how we thought about the problems and tried to address them. We started developing different tools and resources. We developed a much more robust organizational structure to help move projects along, a different membership structure to fold more people into the project and sort of and pull their ideas and information and resources and stuff and disseminate them. And so now Heterodox Academy they have about 4,500 members who are primarily faculty, but also grad students and administrators from all around the country. I stepped down in January of 2020, and so I haven't been like super involved with a lot of the sort of day-to-day operational stuff there. But yeah, at the time I left, we were a very different organization from the one we started with. We had a totally different approach to talking about and engaging on these problems. And it was just a pretty wild journey.
It's interesting because it's sort of the flip side of, maybe not the flip side, but a different version of what Will Wilkinson told me about. I had him on the podcast, and he works for a libertarian think tank, the Niskanen Center. And they had plans for what happened when Hillary Clinton would get elected. Namely, they would work closely with people in Congress to sort of nudge everyone in a more libertarian direction and, reach across the aisle and so forth. And all of those plans went very much out the window when the actual election results came in. But there's sort of how we respond to the moment, and then there's the bigger picture. So I'm sure that there's plenty of listeners who are have heard of the issue of intellectual diversity in the academy, but maybe don't know some of the numbers. So the background fact that you're responding to, and we can talk about what the right response is, but there is a fact, namely that professors in the academy are on average much more liberal than people in the country. And then is that good, or what can we do about it, right? I mean, tell us about the founding impulse for having something like Heterodox Academy.
Yeah, well, I'll say at the outset, actually, one ironic thing about our whole positioning in the lead up to the election is that we were assuming, like everyone, I guess the leadership of Heterodox Academy was assuming, as were most people, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. But part of the reason people had that overconfidence that Hillary Clinton was going to win, ironically, was because there was a certain kind of groupthink that had set in along the expert class. It's the very kind of problem.
There you go. Yeah.
that Heterodox Academy was supposed to be, responding to. I was one of the people who had predicted the election would go the other way, consistently, starting in March 2016. But my view was not the predominant view.
Right.
In the organization or, in general.
Yep.
And so, yes. But so basically the academy skews about, most people in the general population aren't hardcore progressives or conservatives. And that's true in the academy too. There's a lot of people who are moderates, but people who are highly educated, and especially people who are highly educated tend to be more partisan than the general population. So among those who are in academia, you're less likely to be kind of in that middle centrist kind of position. You're someone who's more likely to be more decisively on the left or right. And among those who work in higher ed, the ratio is something like 10-1 left to right in social research fields, and about 5-1 left to right in the academy overall. Mm-hmm. And in terms of political diversity, and that matters. That matters for a number of reasons. I'll say, so some examples of how it matters. It matters in terms of how questions are sort of framed and understood. So, for instance, is inequality a problem? In what senses is it a problem, or is it a phenomenon that should be sort of understood on its own terms? The predominant approach is to start by assuming inequality is a problem that must be rectified, and it's a problem that is described as originating in very particular ways. For instance, it's pretty much exclusively the actions of people in the dominant class, whatever dimension of inequality you're looking at, socioeconomic, racial, gender, sexual orientation, whatever dimension you're looking at, it's people in the dominant class, so whites, men, rich people, heterosexuals, whatever, who are responsible for inequality and its rectification. And there's sort of an asymmetrical way in which these problems are discussed. And there's a value to that, but at the same time, there's a lot that's sort of in virtue of being a highly constrained sort of conceptual field, there are a number of phenomenon and dimensions of these problems which go underexplored or not explored at all. And that can often undermine our ability to actually understand and address the problems that we're trying to solve. So that's, yeah. And it's not just, and in addition to the sort of, I guess, epistemological problems related to the lack of viewpoint diversity in higher ed, there are also sort of more pragmatic problems about the reach of our research and the impact of our research and the viability of our research. So, for instance, most people in the country are religious, but social researchers tend to be pretty not religious and kind of uncomfortable talking about religion or talking about things in religious ways. And so this undermines, in a world where people were more comfortable talking and engaging with these different kind of metaphysical and moral frameworks, we would be more effective at activism. We would be more effective at making the case to policymakers in some cases. We would be more effective at convincing ordinary people about why what we do matters and should be supported. And to the extent that people in the general population don't feel like their views or their values or people like them in general are represented in institutions of higher learning, they don't necessarily feel like they have a stake in those institutions, and in fact often support them being, cut, monitored, surveilled, interfered with, because they assume that it's other people who are sort of that it's some class of people who are not like them using these institutions to attack or ignore or override the will of people like them, etc. So in addition to the epistemological consequences, I guess the short is, a lot of academics have a difficult time engaging with the public and policymakers and about our work as a result of these same shortcomings.
For any business, one of the most high-stakes decisions you make is who to hire. And when you're making high-stakes decisions, it's important to have the best possible information you can as soon as possible. That's why Indeed.com is the place to go to get access to the largest pool of talent so you can hire the right people fast. Indeed.com is the #1 job site in the world because Indeed gets you the best people. Unlike other sites, Indeed gives you full control and payment flexibility over your hiring. You only pay for what you need, you can pause your account at any time, and there are no long-term contracts. Plus, Indeed provides powerful tools to make your search much easier. With 73% of online job seekers visiting Indeed each month, Indeed is going to get you the important hire you need, like they have for over 3 million businesses. Right now, Indeed is offering our listeners a free $75 credit to boost your job post, which means more quality candidates will see it fast. Try Indeed out with a free $75 credit at Indeed.com/Mindscape. This is their best offer available anywhere, so go right now to Indeed.com/Mindscape. Terms and conditions apply. Offer valid through December 31. My reaction is that there's so many things to unpack here, and it's fascinating and difficult to get it all right. I mean, I think the most important thing I want to talk about is why and when and under what circumstances intellectual diversity is important. But let me not ask that right away, because you've already given sort of some basic answers, and I want to dig into it deeper. But there's some things I know are going to instantly be brought up in people's minds, like, okay, if there's a 5-to-1 ratio of liberals to conservatives in academia, why is that? And number two, let's just stick with number one there for a second. I mean, what are the best explanations? Is it because liberals are smarter and better professors? Or is it because conservatives are discriminated against by narrow-minded liberals? Or is it because conservatives self-select out and they join industries or think tanks? And how do we even know what the answer is?
Yeah. So it's a complicated phenomenon, and the short answer is that it seems to be a combination of, I would say it's primarily a combination of discrimination and self-selection. And those two things are related to each other. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, and the reason we know that it's not that conservatives are just intrinsically bad scholars or are not interested in the academy or these kinds of narratives is a few things. One, that until the mid 90s or so, the ratio of liberals to conservatives in the academy was much different. So Sam Abrams, a political scientist at Sarah Lawrence College, has some good data on this. You really saw this shift happen in the professoriate around the mid 90s. And it's a shift that corresponds to changes in the political makeup of the geographical areas of the country where universities tend to be located as well, interestingly enough. So I think part of the shift is responding to sort of broader sociocultural trends in higher ed. One thing that happened around this time, actually, a little bit prior, but kind of around this time, is that there emerged is that think tanks became more of a
Right.
thing, and so you saw the emergence of Heritage. Brookings had existed before that, but Heritage, Cato, other institutions like this. So for libertarians or conservatives who felt ill at ease in the academy, because even though the ratios were much closer than they are today, the academy has been a consistently kind of left skewed institution for as long as there's research on this going back to like going back decades. It's had a pretty consistent left skew, but it wasn't like it is today. So what you saw, I would say around the mid 90s, as you saw the emergence of these sort of alternative academic centers where people could do research and they could and pursue the kinds of questions they wanted to pursue and using the methods they wanted to pursue without worrying about their ideas being spiked, for instance, in peer review or institutional review boards and things like this. We do know that there is a number of biases in things like peer review, institutional review boards, hiring and promotion committees. We know this from empirical research. It's not just along the political dimension. It's actually along a lot of dimensions. So along race, for instance, along gender lines, along the lines of sexuality in many cases. But the political and religious dimension is one dimension in which this kind of discrimination occurs. And to the extent that, and then there becomes this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic where a lot of people go into the academy thinking that an academic career is out of their reach because the academy is skewed and the skew is increasing, and there are these potential concerns about discrimination and things like that. So they don't even try necessarily to even become a professor. They instead plan from the outset to move on to a think tank afterwards, et cetera, right? And so you see this kind of self-selection effect that is responding to perceived discrimination. And so it's kind of a weird, gnarly feedback loop that we're in right now. And so this is the point. One of the things that I talked about in a couple of my essays is that, so the goal of an organization like Heterodox Academy isn't to have the academy, have institutions of higher learning perfectly mirror the ideological base rates in the general population,
Sure.
right? Or the goal is just to create conditions under which, regardless of what one's ideological sensibilities are, your work is going to be, that you're not going to be subject to this kind of discrimination, and that there's not this kind of capture over certain institutions, and especially certain sort of subfields of knowledge. One interesting thing that you see, I'll just note also about the conservatives that are in the academy today, is that for the ones that didn't exit the academy, most of them increasingly they try to work on topics that are non-controversial, that don't dive into political things, and they kind of try to stay on the DL.
Right. Yep.
About what their political leanings
are. Not
are.
step on anyone's toes.
And there's a few reasons for this. Again, part of it is that they're worried about having their work spiked and things like peer review or whatever. But then part of it too is they don't want to end up being that person who they walk into the room and everyone rolls their eyes, or they have something to say, right? So there's kind of a social dimension to this that also matters. No one wants to be a pariah in their department or anything like that. So mostly a lot of the conservatives who remain in the academy today try to work on sort of non-political issues and or try to keep their political leanings kind of close to the vest. And so one consequence of that, ironically, though, is that we're not even able to reap the epistemic benefits, I guess, of the ideological diversity that is in the academy, because what of it there is kind of concealed in many cases. And so we've been talking about the political dimension, but this is also true, like I said, along other lines, along religious lines, for instance.
Well, I want to actually use this as a sort of jumping off point for digging a little bit more deeply into this justification for when and why intellectual diversity is important, because there's certainly a tension going on here, right? On the one hand, I think that a lot of people, if you just ask asked, is diversity important, along intellectual as well as other dimensions, they would probably give a sort of boilerplate positive response to that, right? Like some million idea of the free market of ideas, let a whole bunch of things be bounced around. But on the other hand, we have people who are lifelong committed to their intellectual endeavors, and they think that certain points of view are correct and certain points of view are incorrect, right? And I'm a natural scientist, so I see that in very non-political contexts where, certain departments have nothing but string theorists in them and other departments will never hire a string theorist. And so how do you balance the idea that, I'm very open to the idea that people with liberal political leanings will end up discriminating de facto against people with conservative political leanings. How do you separate that out from just a substantive belief that these people are on the wrong track?
I mean, I think the discrimination is fundamentally rooted in, as you said, in this exactly. It's funny. There's this tension in surveys. There's a sociologist at Columbia. His name is Seamus Khan, and along with Colin Jeromack, he wrote this great essay on what's called the attitudinal fallacy, which is basically what they argue is that in order to understand what people actually believe, it's not enough to kind of like ask them questions, but to look at behaviors, right? So in the abstract, when you ask people, do you support free speech? Do you support diversity? Do you support anything like as you said, people overwhelmingly say yes. But then when they're faced with difficult cases in their local context, and in fact, you don't even have to look at actual behaviors in the world, because sometimes you can actually elicit a similar effect when you just present them with concrete cases, even in polling. So, for instance, one essay that I did was focused on the results of a Cato Institute survey on free expression on campus. And so when they ask students, like, do you support viewpoint diversity? Do you think people with controversial views should be able to speak on campus, et cetera? People overwhelmingly said, yes, great. But then you present them with like specific examples. Like,
this person.
Do you think that, this wasn't from the study, but like off the top of my head, do you think that someone who is a hardcore sort of trans exclusionary feminist should be allowed to speak on campus, right? A lot of people who said, "Oh yes, viewpoint diversity," go, "I don't know about that though," or should we invite someone who should we engage with someone who says who wants to do a talk about inequality, but focused on the role of African Americans in the perpetuation of racial inequality? They'll be like, well, I don't know about that though, or you can go on down the list, right? So if you ask them in general, do you support this? Do you support engaging with views that you disagree with? Everyone says, yes, of course I do. I'm open-minded. Everyone thinks they're open-minded. Everyone, et cetera. But then when you present them with cases that actually challenge their core beliefs, then they're like, and this is a phenomenon that you can see in polling when you zoom into specifics, but is even more clear when people are forced to confront these kinds of decisions in their local context, in the real world, when there's actually things at stake, right? So for instance, with faculty hiring decisions, whoever you bring on when you're hiring a new faculty member is someone that you can expect to work with for years. Yeah. Who you'll have to make decisions with about who to bring into graduate, about which graduate students to admit or not, about a whole range of other things, about how the department is structured. And so these are high stakes decisions that have a lot of sort of, so if you feel like this person is sort of fundamentally opposed to things that you find important or valuable or whatever, it's going to be difficult to justify. It'll be difficult for a lot of people to feel like, even if they believe in diversity in principle, when the rubber meets the road, if they could pick someone who's sort of an ally to themselves, or they can pick this person who they disagree with, assuming their records are kind of comparably, everyone sort of clears the bar of whatever meritocratic decision procedure they have, then people tend to gravitate towards the person who's more like them, the person who's going to be an ally, the person who's going to advance the cause they care about, rather than the person who's not. And that's a normal impulse that people have. But the problem is when everyone makes that same kind of calculation, and virtually all institutions of higher learning have a sort of decisive left skew, and social science departments have an even more pronounced left skew, right? Then you see this kind of, then certain kinds of perspectives are sort of systematically locked out of the academy in general, because because everyone else is making that same calculation that you're making. And so this is one of the challenges. So the tension is, and this is where this kind of work gets hard, where the rubber meeting the road gets challenging, where it's legitimately challenging, is convincing people that in certain circumstances you should try to bring on this person that you disagree with instead of the person who's the ally, because it will benefit the academic community. It will benefit the knowledge environment, but it brings its own challenges. Diversity brings challenges.
With all that's going on in the world right now, it can be hard to focus on things that are long-term and kind of annoying, but nevertheless important. And surely buying life insurance has to be up there on the list of such things. Policygenius.com is here to help. It's a marketplace. It's not an insurance company by itself. You go to Policygenius and you can find different insurers offering you different plans and figure out which one is right for you. Right now, you could save 50% or more by using Policygenius to compare life insurance from different insurers. And the process is simple. You go to the website. In minutes, you can work out how much coverage you need, as well as comparing quotes from top insurers to find the best price. And Policygenius will let you know whether, for example, you can skip the in-person medical exam. And then once you've chosen your policy, Policygenius themselves will handle all the paperwork, all the red tape. The best part is they work for you, not for the insurance company. So if you hit any speed bumps along the way, they will take care of everything. So if you need life insurance, head to Policygenius.com right now to get started. You could save 50% or more by comparing quotes. Policygenius, when it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. Part of my job here is to be the devil's advocate, so I can't help but ask this question. If couldn't I take an attitude that this is exactly the kind of issue that should be solved by the free market? If we find that there is systematic discrimination against brilliant conservative, isn't that a wonderful opportunity for certain departments to corner the market by hiring all these brilliant conservatives that can't get hired anywhere else? I don't necessarily buy that argument, but I'm curious as to what your response is.
Well, so there has been a market solution, an almost literal market solution, and that is the emergence of these private think tanks that are taking all of these conservative intellectuals and whatever who feel like they don't have a place in the academy overall. The problem, though, what you see as a result of that is that basically you get these two sort of separate ecosystems. So you actually lose the benefit of diversity happens when you have these different viewpoints actually engaging with each other and having to answer to each other and clashing with each other and exposing one another's biases. But instead, what you see is two separate echo chambers. You have a sort of think tank echo chamber with a lot of right-wingers or religious people or whatever kind of talking amongst themselves without much of a challenge, referring to one another's work, etc. And then within the mainstream academy, you see a similar phenomenon on the left. And so there's technically diversity in the sense of there are conservative intellectuals, a lot of them outside of the academy. But the benefits of diversity that you get from putting these perspectives into conversation with each other, by being challenged, etc., by collaborating, by having people with differing views actually collaborate on projects and etc., none of that's happening. And in fact, one consequence of that is that a lot of the institutional structures that we have, like peer review or institutional review boards, committee decisions, they're fundamentally premised on the idea of this kind of adversarial thing, that you would have people with diverse frameworks and views and whatever hashing it out. And so as a result, these kinds of committee decisions, like peer review and institutional review boards and committee decisions and whatever, will push us towards a more objective, more truthful, more accurate, understanding of reality, towards better decisions, more objective decisions, etc. But in a world where the people making decisions all share the same axioms, the same blind spots, the same assumptions about the world, then rather than correcting biases by means of things like peer review or committee decisions, you can actually exacerbate biases, like as a result of these processes that were supposed to correct the
Right.
biases. And I think that's been the consequence of taking the sort of I guess hands off. I guess the nonchalant perspective that, look, if they don't fit in here, they'll figure it out. Someone will, life finds a way. That's a Jurassic Park metaphor.
Yeah.
But I guess the point is this, they did find a place where they can do, research and pursue scholarship and whatever. But it's just there are a whole bunch of negative consequences for this. And one negative consequence, ironically, for institutions of higher learnings and academics, I'll say, is that a number of policymakers then, the think tanks from the very beginning, think tanks like Heritage and AEI, et cetera, were tightly connected with policymakers, with practical applications. And as a result of the fact that institutions of higher learning don't really have, and especially specific fields, don't really have a lot of political diversity and are perceived as being partisan fields, there's a whole range of like, if you're a Republican policymaker and you're trying to formulate, say, a response to say COVID-19 or something like that, you're not going to you're probably not going to consult, say, a sociologist about. You're not going to look at, like, what do sociologists have to say about this if you're a Republican lawmaker, because your assumption about sociology is that all a sociologist is going to tell you is you're wrong, you're stupid, you're evil.
Right.
You should probably become a Democrat, right? If that's what you think you're going to hear from a sociologist, if you ask for their opinion about something, is basically you should abandon entirely your whole sort of premise and approach to policymaking. Then you're just not even going to waste your time. You're going to ask someone, maybe an economist instead. And then, and this is part of the reason why economics has this kind of prestige it has among the social sciences compared to other fields like anthropology and sociology, is because it's relatively less skewed. It's still significantly skewed in favor of the left, but less so. And even left-leaning economists are known to, like, talk and engage with people on the right in an amicable way and can offer in a way that's different from, say, the reputation of sociology or anthropology or.
But this brings up a different way of being a devil's advocate in the following up on the starting point of how things have changed since the Trump election and so forth. Like, are there people who would say, if asked, I have no trouble talking to, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, I'm a leftist. I have no trouble whatsoever with people in my department saying that the free market is a best engine of growth. I might disagree with them, but I can talk to them. I have no trouble at all talking to people who say that God exists and, they go to church every day. But I don't want people in my department who say that, gay marriage should be illegal, or we shouldn't invest in Africa because black people are too stupid to use the resources that we give them. I just think that's too dehumanizing to allow in my department. Is that a different kind of issue? Are there intellectual diversities that it's okay to not want to have?
So I mean, yeah. So yes. So there are always there are sort of limits. So the way I always talk about it and think about it is that viewpoint diversity, I think, should be understood best as an instrumental good rather than an absolute good. So it's valuable for the purpose of increasing our knowledge and understanding about the world, helping us engage with a wider swath of society, et cetera. You can list the ways in which it's instrumentally valuable, but it's not something that you pursue just for its own sake, in my view. And so to the extent that, and so there implicit in that is an idea that there could be things that fall outside the scope, right? So if it's
they might be hard to decide what they are, but they might be there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a tough question. It's not a question that you can easily answer. It's a question that has to be worked out by intellectual communities, sort of responsive to their needs and priorities and things like that. But so, for instance, if you're a geographer, you don't necessarily need a flat Earth geography person or something like that, right? So these kinds of like paradigm cases that people evoke to say, but shouldn't there be some kind of limits? Yes, there should be some kind of limits. But the problem is right now, I would say is that we're very far, so I guess the point is this: there is a sense in which, in principle, viewpoint diversity, a campaign for viewpoint diversity could be overly permissive, folding in a bunch of viewpoints that actually aren't valuable for helping us understand the world, helping us understand society, things like that. But we're very far from that. And one of the tensions is that and I guess one helpful distinction too is to draw a line between is that it's helpful to think, I guess, between sort of empirical, just purely empirical problems, which can be resolved or more straightforwardly empirical problems, I guess. So questions about whether or not the Earth is flat versus
more factual problem
versus sort of social questions that involve that take you beyond just questions about facts, but also into questions about values and priorities. The sociologist Gil Ayal has a pithy way of putting it as trans-scientific questions.
Yeah, I mean this really makes me wonder what to do. And I'm not playing devil's advocate now. This is something where I truly don't know what the answer should be. On the one hand, it makes perfect sense to say, unlike facts, values are not shared by different people, and therefore we should have diversity of values because we can't just do an experiment to decide who's right. On the other hand, I can easily see people saying, but these values that person has are just out of bounds. I don't those deny my basic humanity, and I don't want to engage with them. So I'm sure this is a hard question to answer, but how do we decide which values we want to be diverse with respect to?
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question to answer, but I mean, I think some helpful guidelines or ways to sort of structure So one of them, for instance, is if it's a widely held view that a lot of people in society hold, that a lot of policymakers hold, then it's a kind of view that you're going to have to engage with, and that if you don't engage with, it's actually probably going to be counterproductive to advancing, whatever your values are, if you just can't even talk to or understand where other people are from. So when you're talking about sort of weird niche views that not too many people hold, then those are the kinds of things which can be more safely excluded, although still under certain circumstances there might be reasons to engage with them anyway. But for things that are sort of that there's millions and millions of people in America who you will have to engage with, or policymakers or whatever, who hold a certain view. And if you're saying that's out of bounds, that's something that I'm not even going to be able to deal with or talk about or whatever, then that's a problem. That's a problem for you in a very practical sense. And that's a problem also, again, and so for instance, on the question of whether or not, to return to one of your examples about, say, gay marriage or something, that's a topic in which Americans have moved substantially over the last 10 years.
Right.
But there are still a number of Americans who hold the view that marriage is a religious sacrament between a man and a woman, etc. And if you're putting it beyond the pale to even talk with those people or understand where they're coming from or engage their perspectives and views, then not only are you then you're undermining your ability to, one, reach those people, and then two, in some cases you might be even undermining your ability to understand. Well, that's a sort of policy, but you might be undermining your ability to understand the phenomenon in question, right? So I guess that's one thing, is like, if it's a view that's sort of widely held that a lot of people in America hold, then it's a view that you should probably be engaging with. And this is, so for instance, and you see this playing out in a few ways. So for instance, with the election of Donald Trump, a lot of social researchers, they can't imagine how anyone could reasonably vote for Donald Trump.
Right. And that is a problem, because it is their job to imagine that, right?
Well, and so a consequence of that is that a lot of the research on Trump and his supporters basically starts from the premise that there must be something wrong with those people. So they try to explain Trump votes by looking specifically at pathologies or deficits. So there are whole studies that are literally designed like, what best explains why someone would vote for Trump? Is it that they're more racist or sexist or authoritarian or ignorant, right? And so all the options are bad. It can't be that they voted for Trump because they, are patriotic or whatever, that they love their families or they're concerned about, so all the options are bad. And there's not a symmetrical analysis with respect to why people voted for, say, Hillary Clinton, right? Like sometimes they measure the extent to which they try to frame Trump votes as motivated by sexism, for instance, but don't explore the extent to which these same factors could explain Hillary Clinton votes. And there's just a lack. Like if someone designed a study that was like, why would someone vote for Hillary Clinton? Is it because they're communists or they hate America or right or something like that? We would immediately go, well, that's a prejudicial study design. That's not. But when it applies to the Trump voter, that's a perfectly normal thing. And the impulse that sort of generates that, this is a kind of thing you see in a lot of fields, right? And not just with respect to Trump. That's just an easy example because it's current. But researchers in general approach situations by thinking that their own views are correct. That's why we hold the views, because we think they're correct. So our own sort of theoretical perspectives, metaphysical views, moral views, etc. And so one consequence of that assumption, though, is that we tend to assume that we tend to use our own sort of position as the baseline against which others should be measured. And then deviance from that baseline is often explained again in terms of negative attributes, some kind of deficit, some kind of pathology. Right. And this even holds in cases where the scholars themselves hold demonstrably idiosyncratic views. So on a number of issues, on a range of things, academics are kind of weird with respect to the rest of society, like the way we talk about things, the way we think about things. But when academics notice a divergence between how they think about the world and how others seem to think about the world, the question isn't usually, why do people like us hold such idiosyncratic views on this matter, right? The question is, what's wrong with everyone else such that they can't see the obviously correct answer here? And that matters. That matters for a few reasons. Like one of them, for instance, one consequence of this sort of other-oriented, blaming other people kind of approach to studying social issues is that there's often sort of blind spots. So I've written a little bit on, for instance, racialized inequality in the United States. I have an article that I recently published in Sociological Forum on this, where people in the professional, what is often been called the professional managerial class, often when they're trying to understand a phenomenon like racialized inequality, the first people they look at to assume as the bad guys, as the people who are responsible for racialized inequality are the millionaires and billionaires, the 1%, et cetera. It's like these elites over here are the ones who are responsible for this problem. The issue with that is that millionaires and billionaires don't just sort of make things happen as if by magic. They work through institutions, right? Institutions run by the professional managerial class. So if you want to understand how a lot of these phenomena happen, you have to look at media organizations and institutions of higher learning and government bureaucracies. These are the institutions through which the 1% exercise their will. It would actually be impossible for a lot of these conditions to be maintained without the active participation of people in the professional managerial class. But to the extent that they focus that people within that class don't look at their own actions and behaviors, don't consider the way their own institutions serve to reify and perpetuate these states of affairs, they have a poor understanding of how the social phenomena come about, of what to do about them. So I mean, there are significant consequences that sort of flow from this blind spot.
So I think we can finally get to the question I suppressed way at the beginning, which was, what are we going to do about it? Or, what is a strategy for dealing with it? I really liked one of the essays you wrote on diversity training programs and how, their hearts are in the right place. Diversity is good. And they're typically diversity training programs for, racism and sexism and things like that, not for political or religious orientation. But you point out that they generally are not effective in actually fixing the problem. It seems like this problem of viewpoint diversity within the academy would be even harder to solve in a systematic way. Or is the strategy just to sort of bring people's attention into it to sort of let them self-correct because their hearts are also in the right place, hopefully.
Yeah. So I mean, the diversity training thing, I'll just bracket that actually. Okay. So yeah, the general strategy though, the general hope is, when people say things like, I believe in engaging with people I disagree with. I believe in, like, I don't think that they're lying about that. I think they're sincere about that, even though when presented with concrete cases, a lot of times they have this kind of like, reaction, right? When it's time to put those values into practice, that turns out to happen less than maybe they're aware of or would desire. So living those values is tough. So what Heterodox Academy and other initiatives like it are trying to do is provide people with tools and resources to better live those values. So a lot of people, so for instance, if you're a professor and you're like, you know what, I think maybe we should be engaging more with, say, conservative or religious perspectives in studying these issues. But you're not conservative and religious. You don't know too many people who are. You don't even know where to start. So like, how would you design a syllabus, for instance, on racial inequality that folds in conservative or religious perspectives if you're not familiar with them yourself, right? It would be hard. But what Heterodox Academy is trying to do is provide people with resources, so like template. So this is one thing that we're trying to do now is crowdsource, for instance, syllabi made by people who support the mission and who have tried to sort of incorporate conservative or religious perspectives into their exploration of some of these issues. If they've taught a class based on the syllabus and it went really well and it was valuable, then like our perspective was like, share it with us. This is a resource that other people can use, right? So we can crowdsource what works to lower the bar, to lower the amount of effort it takes for people to put it into practice. So that's one sort of plank, is trying to crowdsource what works from other people and learn from that. So that we're not having to reinvent the wheel, each of us, from scratch, because that's a high bar. I mean, that in itself often disincentivizes people who agree in principle but don't know where to start. So they just kind of do what they've always done. But another plank, I guess, is drawing people's awareness to the problem. So, people know that the academy skews left, for instance, or that it's a secular institution, but they're less aware maybe of, one, how dire the skew is, and two, the fact that it's not just kind of an organic thing that happens, but it's a thing that people actively, create through discriminatory behaviors or actions that they might not even be necessarily aware of. So making them aware of them can help, and spelling out the consequences of, if we don't have these kinds of diversity, here's how it messes up our understanding of the world. Here's how it undermines the viability of our research in the future, or the impact of our research here and now, et cetera. So spelling out the consequences is helpful for creating a sense of urgency around the problem. And then cultivating sort of communities of practice. I guess this is related to the crowdsourcing thing, but putting people in touch with one another. So if you're someone who's concerned about this problem, but when you look around your department, you don't necessarily know that anyone else is concerned about this problem, or, then it can be hard to be the one to kind of, right? But if you know that there are a whole bunch of other people in your field who are also concerned about this, who are committed to doing something about it, then we're trying to sort of create communities where people within different fields can collaborate together, think on this together, work it out together. Because what Heterodox Academy doesn't think, is that they're in a position to just kind of decree, like, this is what must happen. But we are, these are questions that intellectual communities have to work out within themselves, that different fields have to work out, that different, universities have to work out in accordance with their own needs, their own priorities, et cetera. So we want to facilitate them doing that. That's the main role of Heterodox Academy, is to help facilitate those efforts.
I think,
but
go ahead.
At the same time, one thing that we're concerned about, and that we're trying to, and that motivates some of the urgency we have around this problem, is that we recognize that there are people in this country, all around, policymakers, ordinary citizens, et cetera, who also recognize, who are not patient, who are not content to let academics figure this out themselves, either because they don't trust the academics, or because they think the problem has been going on too long and there's nothing changing, or maybe it's even getting worse, or whatever. And so there are all these external stakeholders who are trying to find ways to intervene in the academy in a way that runs contrary to academic freedom, that is often kind of these ham-fisted interventions that make things worse rather than better, politicize things more rather than taking down. And everything from Fox News campaigns to get people fired to, state legislatures defunding, sociology and other fields like that, like as happened in Wisconsin, to interventions at the federal level, for instance, like Trump and his attempted executive orders on free speech and things like this. So if this isn't a problem so I guess the urgency for us is that we recognize that this right now, these are problems that we can try to address within the academy by acting together, by thinking through these with a sense of urgency, by trying to reform institutions in ways that preserve academic freedom, that enhance knowledge production and things like that. But if these problems continue to be ignored by us, they're not being ignored, outside. And eventually, probably sooner rather than later, these outside actors are going to be able, and actually already are, but will probably be increasingly able to threaten academic freedom, threaten autonomy of professors and institutions of higher learning, very hard-fought autonomy that organizations like the AAUP and the AAC&U have been fighting to preserve since 1910. Already tenure is being eroded radically. I mean, like something like 70% of new academic appointments today are non-tenure track, and even for people who are on the tenure track, are sometimes being fired for political reasons. And so these are problems that it's still within our capacity to help sort of resolve some of these problems ourselves, but it won't be that way forever. So that's kind of the urgency that we have for trying to sort of resolve some of these issues.
Let me even take the lens back a little bit more to a wider perspective here, because these issues of why it's good in the academy, you forget about politics and forget, I like the points you just made, don't get me wrong, but if I'm just worried about being the best intellectual I can be, being the best thinker about thing, you've written interesting essays on the role of critique and how it's so important to have this attitude, I guess, towards ideas that we should be suspicious of them in some sense. And somehow, if we put aside, modern politics and contemporary worries, there is this fundamental value or orientation difference in my mind that maybe maps onto some of these questions between people who say, look, most changes that we could make to the present system would be bad. We spent a lot of time coming up with the present system, and so don't ruin it just for the sake of change. And those people will be labeled conservatives, and other people will say, well, it's clear the present system can't be the best system we have. There's all sorts of influences on it that are not oriented towards making things that they can. So our job is to undermine the present system. And, how do we balance in a very broad sense the project of being the best intellectual we can, given these, competing, fairly reasonable sounding claims?
Yeah. And actually, I think you put your thumb pretty firmly on the issue of, for instance, why conservative perspectives would be more valuable in the academy than a lot of people understand. And it's precisely this orientation towards tradition and concern about things like, harm caused by naive interventionism, the fact that the things that persist sometimes persist for a reason, and that if we don't understand sort of how they came about and why they persist, then when we change things, we can often make things worse. And, history is replete with examples of people trying to make radical changes to society and it not working out how they anticipated, but two, not just them failing to achieve their planned objectives, but making things far, far, far worse. And sometimes sliding into just outright totalitarianism and famine and things like that. So there is, and so you really need these two, but at the same time, absent the sort of progressive impulse of critique and of critiquing the prevailing order and looking for improvement, right? Then you get stagnation and similarly, it's those are social orders that also tend not to be to persist because they aren't responsive to contemporary needs, to contemporary concerns and priorities. So you really need these orientations to be in dialogue with one another.
you did half of answering the question. I mean, you gave a good pep talk for taking on board the more conservative notion of let's be suspicious of proposed changes, right? But there is the leftist progressive liberal point of view of let's be suspicious of the present system as well, which also serves a purpose. And I know that you value that purpose as well. So maybe I'll give you a chance to say something about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So yeah. So I mean, one fact of the matter is that part of the reason that social orders exist is usually because they solve sort of specific problems, and that caused the collapse of the previous order, and that led to the emergence of the new one. And part of the reason why it's stable is because it actually is working pretty well for a lot of people. But it's often the case that there are a number of people for whom the prevailing order does not work and has never worked, and there are people who are excluded and marginalized and disadvantaged, and they matter too, right? So this is one of the sources of critique of the prevailing social order. Often comes from these people for whom the social order isn't working well, for people who are marginalized and disenfranchised. Additionally, social orders come into being usually in a particular context, a particular historical context, in response to particular challenges from particular actors. But the world evolves, situations evolve, the challenges change, and to the extent that society can't change with them, then it tends then that social order tends not to survive. So for both of those reasons, one, to help elevate and ensure the dignity of people for whom the social order has not been serving well, and then two, to make sure that the social order sort of is responsive to contemporary needs and pressing circumstances, right? This is why that impulse towards critique and that impulse towards change matters and is important and is absolutely essential. I mean, literally, again, social orders tend to collapse or die without that impulse as well. And so these are perspectives that need to be put into contact with one another. One ironic thing, though, I'll say, and actually this is why they need to be put in dialogue with each other, is that the sort of the impulse to critique is usually other oriented.
Yes.
Right. Or usually you're critiquing, again, things you disagree with, things that aren't working well for you. You're critiquing people who are perceived to be your ideological adversaries or whatever. And again, a lack of reflexivity, of turning the critical lens towards oneself, towards the actors that one agrees with, towards the causes that one agrees with or sympathizes with, is often the reason why these sort of well-intentioned things go awry. It's because, the critique-oriented people, the change-oriented people are focused on changing and critiquing everyone else. And so
they're the ones who are wrong.
This is why diversity is important. This is why it can't just be if you have the critique-centered people, that somehow, that it'll be self-correcting with just those people, because you need the lens to be turned against the people who are making those critiques.
Well, it's I agree, and but I worry that it gets a bit utopian. I mean, I worry that in a world where there are plenty of people who are willing to critique me, and you're asking me to now join them in critiquing me, this couldn't I better spend my time critiquing the wrong people rather than myself? But I think I say that jokingly because it is important, because on the one hand we should have some convictions and move forward on the basis of them, and at the same time we should be always questioning that we haven't gotten things right, and it's just so difficult to pull off in practice.
Well, and one reason why it's important, I'll flag, is that is actually this is super important for trying to help people from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups. So one irony, for instance, is that, for instance, look at African Americans or Hispanic, or lower socioeconomic status people, the people who are not well served by this, basically. Mm-hmm. They often skew more socially conservative. So like Blacks and Hispanics are most socially conservative on average than whites. So are many immigrant communities. They're also more religious on average than whites. And low socioeconomic status people the same way compared to upper socioeconomic status people. And so if you create an environment environment that's hostile towards, for instance, socially conservative or religious views, that will disproportionately affect people of color. It will disproportionately affect immigrants. It will disproportionately affect, first generation students, lower socioeconomic students. So sometimes what happens is, in the very name of championing people from disadvantaged groups, we alienate and ignore some of those very people. And it's important, if you want to help promote the interests of, say, African Americans, to listen to what African Americans actually want. So, for instance, with respect to police reform, there's a movement to defund the police. But if you ask Black people, do you want to defund the police? They overwhelmingly say no. They want substantive police reform. They want to end discrimination, but they want police in their communities, like communities dealing with crime, with violent crime, want police. And a lot of times I've written extensively about police reform, and this is always a check on me as well, that I try to check myself when I get a little too amped up about the problems with law enforcement, and is trying to keep in mind the fact that, I come from a very particular position. I'm at an Ivy League school. I'm not from a wealthy background. I started at community college and whatever, but like the milieu in which I'm currently enmeshed and the environment in which I'm is very different from that of most African Americans. Similarly, and so for substantial things like that, and then even for more, where oftentimes the desires and opinions of the very people you're supposedly championing are being ignored. And that happens in substantial issues. That also happens in trivial issues. Like, for instance, the term Latinx is often championed as the proper way of referring to people of Hispanic or Latino origin. But if you ask people of Hispanic or Latino origin, do you like the term Latinx? Do you consider yourself this? Like, overwhelmingly, 80-20. They say, no, we don't like this term. Right. This doesn't, even when you ask people of, there's a great essay report that just came out in the New York Times, where, for instance, a lot of speech coded as racist dog whistles. So usually they would take, say, some rhetoric from Trump, and they would say, this is a dog whistle that appeals to sort of white supremacist leanings or whatever. And so because they come with this analytical frame, it didn't occur to a lot of researchers to ask people of color how they understood these comments, because the researchers said, that's racist, right? They didn't ask, do you find this racist? But when they did that, it turned out that a lot of that Black people were no less likely than white people, that the messages resonated just as strongly with Blacks as with whites, and resonated even more strongly with Hispanics than African Americans or whites. So these dog whistles resonated more strongly with minorities than with white people, and people across the board didn't find them racist. Similarly with microaggressions, when you present Black and Hispanic people with canonical microaggressions and ask them, do you find this offensive? Overwhelmingly, they do not find them offensive, let alone harmful. And the reason that this matters, that this microaggressions fact matters, is because we do know from research, however, that when people perceive themselves to have been the target of racism or discrimination, that corresponds to a number of negative emotional effects, mental health effects, even just physical health effects. So sensitizing people more to these things that they don't currently find offensive. So taking people of color and teaching them that they should be offended by these things that they're not currently offended by would probably correlate with worse mental health outcomes, worse physical outcomes, worse, interpersonal outcomes for minorities, by trying to sensitize them to these slights that they don't find offensive right now, ostensibly in the name of promoting their own interests, right? So it's important. So I guess the shorthand is, oftentimes, disturbingly, this impulse to champion people from historically marginalized and underrepresented groups, oftentimes scholars ignore those very people whose interests they're championing. And I'll say they don't necessarily ignore them entirely. What happens is you'll have elites who represent those groups, basically, whose views are not representative, whose views are more in line with other white elites than with the typical Black or Hispanic person, for instance, will be serving as the sort of lead on the reference point for other academics about what is in Black or Hispanic people's interests. So, for instance, people are going to consult Ta-Nehisi Coates about, well, what do Black people want? What's good for Black people? Let's see what Coates has to say, right? Rather than let's poll African Americans.
Right.
that's a problem, right? Because Coates is again, he's great, but his views on the world are demonstrably out of touch. His socioeconomic position is demonstrably out of step, etc., with the typical Black or Hispanic person. So if you're looking at Coates to understand what's best for the typical Black or Hispanic person, you're probably going to be led astray. And this is a trap that we fall into.
I think we're closing up here, so let me just sort of give you an open question that you can answer as you choose. I mean, a lot of these individual specific issues we've been talking about play into the question of the role of the intellectual in modern society. And I think the word intellectual has even become hard to take seriously in some sense. Like if you call yourself intellectual, you're pretentious, and it's used in a sort of denigrating sense in some way. There's a feeling that we live in a world where the discourse is not really fundamentally intellectually oriented. What do you think about that situation we're in, and does it turn into any specific advice you could give on would-be or current intellectuals out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I definitely hear that. I mean, I've had to struggle a lot myself. Even, I mean, again, I don't come from a background where the word intellectual would be understood as a positive thing. It would be a derisive thing you said about someone. And so it's been a journey myself to understand myself as an intellectual in a non, I guess, anyway. So I mean, I guess my advice to people, one bit of advice to people is that I think academics have been kind of bad at explaining things like, why our work matters, connecting the work we do to the needs and priorities of ordinary people. And this matters especially, I think, for scholars at institutions that are paid for largely through taxpayer funds. I feel like a lot of taxpayers and politicians who represent them feel like, and not unreasonably, that if they're making these large investments in these institutions of higher learning, that there should be some kind of benefit to them or society or whatever, that emerges out of this investment that the public is making in these institutions. And I don't know that intellectuals have done an excellent job of explaining what that benefit is. And so I guess one plank is that I think intellectuals need to do better at engaging with the public, talking about their research in more accessible and compelling ways to ordinary people, engaging in more events outside of the academy to engage with, just people in their communities, and their needs and priorities and concerns, connecting their scholarship to sort of practical matters that people care about. That's one plank. Oh, but I will say there are actually some great organizations out there whose purpose is to help connect academics to the public, such as Scholar Strategy Network, or the Frameworks Institute has good work about how to talk about matters in a compelling way to the public, and I think that would help. Yeah.
Well, I think it's some good advice. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Musa al-Gharbi, thanks so much for being on the Mindscape podcast.
Thank you for having me.